Welcome, and thank you for joining this session of Innovation Institute 2021. With nearly 50 sessions available through the summer, we know you'll be discovering new skills, strategies, and resources to transform the teaching and learning in your classroom, and we would love to hear from you. If you haven't already done so, please be sure to visit the Town Hall in Attendify to connect with the attendees through the activity stream or community features. If you would like a certificate of attendance for attending this session, you will find the request form linked at the end of the session description in Attendify. Thank you, and enjoy this session from one of our amazing Innovation Institute presenters.
Welcome to our presentation. We're so glad that you're joining us for this session. My name is Mears, and I'm the coordinator of the Educational Technology Program at the University of Arkansas. And working with me today is Jade Mears, who is a 6th grade science teacher at the Don Tyson School of Innovation. Our topics today are really about trying to make sense of all the various types of web-based learning initiatives that we see in K-12 schools and higher education. We're going to focus on concepts such as blended learning, personalized learning, flipped classrooms, and inquiry-based learning. So as an overview for the session, I'll be introducing you to some of these various web-based learning models that are common in K-12 schools, and then Jade will then take over to show you how she's implementing some of these initiatives in her classroom. But first, let's take a look at online learning overall in our K-12 schools. Now, this data was obviously pre-pandemic. As at some time during the last year, the number of students in K-12 who engaged in fully online learning at some point during either the 2021 school year or the year before, 2019-2020, was really at 100%. So we're not sure where we're going to be in the future with these statistics, but it's assumed that we will probably return to some degree or some level that's similar to this. So during pre-pandemic, about 300,000 students were enrolled in online learning or fully online schools in the country. 30 states were offering fully online state schools, and 26 of those states had virtual schools that were funded by the state themselves. About 16%, therefore, of the overall population was enrolled in an online school. And it will be interesting to see as we start to return to our normal schooling for next year, if this trend increases, and are we going to need more virtual school teachers? The state has made different initiatives that indicate this could be the case. As here at the University of Arkansas, we have we just received a large grant from the Arkansas Department of Education to offer an academy for helping teachers become certified in the new K-12 online teaching credential that's being released by the state. So there's definitely some investment from the state of Arkansas, anyway, in training more teachers to teach virtually or teach online in K-12 schools. So the question becomes, why are K-12 students and parents choosing online learning? Online learning really started with the idea of credit recovery. The idea is that if someone needed to catch up, students got behind in classes. But more recently, reasons such as choosing a curriculum that is more challenging, which can be a misconception when you look at overall coursework. But in some of this data, there's like discussions of rural areas where advanced placement courses may be difficult to offer due to staffing or the number of students interested in taking those courses. And online courses have stepped in to help fill this gap by offering like advanced AP courses online. Some other common reasons are based that parents just not feeling that traditional schools were a good fit for their student, and so they decide to place them in an online school. Physical health is always an issue that goes with this. So sometimes personal, social, emotional health issues provide a rationale for students and parents to choose an online school. Issues related to school safety and bullying are common reasons that have shown up and causing students to move to a virtual classroom. Since this data, though, is also based on parent and student survey data, it's hard to truly assess the validity of some of those claims as legitimate reasons for parents choosing to move their students online. Those could have just been individual school settings or individual relationships that those students might have had with students in that particular building they were working in. But there are definitely things that school districts and administrations have to take into consideration in planning instruction for students in the future. So let's take a look at some of the models that are used in online learning in K-12 schools. The first one is trying to understand this big misconception, the discussion of what's hybrid learning and what's blended learning, because in some ways they're very similar, but in some ways they're very different. Blended learning is learning that combines structured face-to-face and structured online learning. And what I mean by structured is the time frame that the student spends online and the time frame that they spend face-to-face are preset. For example, in some of our schools in Northwest Arkansas, there's been a blended model that's been going on during the pandemic where students attend school face-to-face 2 days a week and then do online instruction 3 days a week. That would be an example of blended because the amount of time that they spend is set. They're always in school face-to-face 2 days. They're always online 3 days. This is very difficult in a normal setting to do in a traditional school without structuring the calendar and structuring the setting and structuring transportation and everything in which for that model to take place. Hybrid learning, however, is slightly different. Hybrid learning in K-12 most commonly is applied in the face-to-face classroom where students are in one-to-one schools. In other words, each student has their own device. What happens in this type of thing is that there is some degree of instruction that takes place face-to-face, some degree of instruction that takes place online. But it's not always a set time frame as to what is spent where, because all the instruction is still taking place underneath the same time frame. So for example, one day an instructor might spend or teacher might spend more time providing face-to-face instruction with little online work. Or perhaps the following day of the week, they may be working fully online on their devices during the day, and there's very little face-to-face instruction. So hybrid is basically the shift to find the best mix of what works in that situation versus having a structure that this day is online, this day is face-to-face, like happens in blended. One thing we have to be careful with, though, in all of these settings, whether blended or hybrid, is making sure that when we design instruction, we're designing blended learning or hybrid learning versus just tech-rich instruction. The primary difference is that in blended learning, there's independence and personalization in what students do. It's kind of the precursor to personalized learning, which we will be talking about in a little bit. Whereas tech-rich instruction is basically just taking some of the normal procedures of the traditional classroom and doing them online instead. For example, in tech-rich instruction, students all do the same work at the same pace. The devices are just used to support instruction and maybe enhance to some degree the traditional experience. To kind of understand this, we're going to take a look at a video from Richard Coletta that kind of talks about that particular concept.
But there's a more serious digital divide that we face in the country. And that is the divide between those who know how to use technology to reimagine learning and those who simply use technology to digitize traditional learning practices. When I was 14, I got this thing called a flatbed scanner. And it was kind of cool because you could take a picture like this. That's my little kiddo. You could put it on that flatbed scanner and it would turn that analog photograph into a digital photograph. Now, it didn't change the experience any. It's still a photograph. It was just a digital version of it. When I travel around the country and visit with schools, I see a similar thing happening with the way that we approach integrating technology. Maybe some of these examples will be familiar to you. We take a chalkboard and we digitize it. We take a textbook and we digitize it. We take a boring linear lecture and we make digital boring linear lecture. And my fear is that if we continue on this trajectory, very soon we will have successfully replicated in digital format exactly all of the traditional teaching methods that we use today. And I'm not sure that's what we want.
And so what we need to look at in blended learning and hybrid learning and even personalized learning is the idea is how can we use technology to reimagine what the student does, not merely replicate what they would do in a straight face-to-face classroom. So let's look at the components of some of this. Flipped classroom is to some degree a subset model of the hybrid or the blended model. And what happens in flipped classroom is that online learning time is used introducing instructional concepts most traditionally in this model. And the face-to-face time is then used for group practice and student-to-student engagement and interaction with the content. This allows some degree of flexibility in the arrangement of the instructional time on the part of the teacher. The pillars of this is the environment is flexible. It allows for instructors to rearrange their learning spaces to accommodate a certain lesson or unit, whether it's independent study or group work, and gives teachers some flexibility. It also helps teachers move to being more the facilitator versus the sage on the stage or the traditional teacher-centered model. Class time is more dedicated to exploring in-depth topics, whereas in online models is where most of the instructional pieces take place. So there'll be brief instructional that takes online and the working with content and face-to-face. To be effective, this model might work better for some content areas than others. Mathematics has been an area that has been pretty on the forefront of flipped classroom models where students will have online instruction on how to work particular types of problems, solve particular types of mathematical equations. And then they work on problem sets and solutions during face-to-face time where the teacher can give instruction, or the students can also serve as a peer teaching models in these as well. The content in a flipped classroom, though, is very intentional. It's usually very, very directed. They're looking for this particular mindset. It doesn't have as big of a degree of flexibility as when we start to get into personalized learning and some other components of the models. But it does give this concept of allowing a teacher more time to spend in the face-to-face classroom working on engaging students with the content and engaging students with each other versus providing direct instruction. And that's what happens quite often with this particular model. That instructor in this flipped classroom then serves as more of the facilitator, as I mentioned earlier, and helping students to assess their work, helping students provide feedback when needed, and assistance on working through the content. The next one we'll look at is personalized learning. Personalized learning is one of the newest parts of one of these models, and really has as its core at the concept of optimizing the learning pace for each student, with a focus on providing content that's meaningful, as well as individualized goal setting. The model itself has 4 components, namely competency-based progressions, where students master key competencies and progress toward them as they are mastering them. The learning environment is flexible to the individual learning, allowing students to be at different stages when interacting with the content. Students also have personal learning paths and personal profiles that help with tracking their progress. The model itself does require a considerable shift in the mindset of your traditional classroom setting and reimagining how you can deliver instruction, as it requires a grade to be of, obviously by name, individualization, to where you're working with different students and they may be at different levels of that competency-based mastery of the things that they're working on. But before I turn over to Jade, I think it's very important with all of these models to talk about one of the areas that we sometimes make some of the biggest mistakes in blended settings and personalized learning environments and flipped classroom settings. And that is the idea of not being cognizant of a concept called cognitive load. Cognitive load is basically the amount of mental stress that's placed on a learner when they're completing various tasks. And it can vary based on the task that they're working with. Sometimes students have intrinsic, to where the complexity of the material may cause a higher cognitive load than something that the material may not be as complex. The area that we have to look at, particularly in online instruction, is extraneous. In other words, the cognitive load that we impose on a learner on non-relevant elements, requiring them to do extra mental processing. We all have this tendency when we design something online. When we're working in a classroom, we might give the students one resource to read. But we have this time, because this idea when we build an online class or module that's, let's give them 10 resources. Students interpret the fact that way, though, many times that they have to read all 10 resources. And what you've asked them to do then is you're increasing their extraneous cognitive load by saying this is 3 times more material than they would have been introduced to had they been in your traditional face-to-face classroom. So it's important that when you're planning instruction in an online setting, you want to think as you would in a face-to-face classroom, ensuring you do not increase that extraneous cognitive load by giving them more resources online than they would have to process face-to-face, or requiring more time of them to engage with the content that they would in the face-to-face classroom. And that's critical to ensure that you don't overload the students. For example, if a student does a 20-minute silent reading in class and then answers 3 to 4 response questions, that would approximately take up 1 class period. However, if you put that online and gave them an additional 20 or 30 minutes of reading, an additional 2 or 3 questions to answer, now you've really asked them to complete the same amount of coursework. You've asked them to complete 2 classes instead of 1, in 2 class periods instead of 1. A similar way would be, for example, you have to resist that urge to give that greater content. Like, for example, if you're doing a flipped lesson and you have students complete an hour of content online prior to class, where they then work on problem sets for an hour, what you've just had is 2 class periods instead of 1. So you want to make sure that if you're asking them to do flipped, you're saying, okay, I'm going to spend about 30 minutes of this in the face-to-face class, so that flipped session should really only be about 30 minutes of this as well. And you think about the concept, if I was giving that student 30 minutes of homework, then maybe that's built into this piece in their preparation. So we just want to be careful that we don't look at having students do twice the amount of engagement time with the content than they would if they were in a face-to-face class. So be careful when you're designing your lessons. Look at these 5 ways that you can reduce that cognitive load. Use verbal as well as visual content. Do some screen captures, do some diagrams, you can do some podcast or screencasts, but use a variety of things. Break content into smaller segments, unfortunately not like this presentation. Normally when I design presentations for my students in class, I never have a video that's more than 3 minutes long, because data has indicated that about 85% of those students will disengage with something that's long. So I hope I haven't lost some of you all by now. Remove content that's not essential. Really focus on saying, these are the resources I want students to look at, and not having additional, these are nice to knows in there. Words and graphics placed close together, and then try not to narrate on-screen text when you're doing these different presentations. Give summarizations of the slides versus narrating everything that's on them. So at this stage, I'm going to turn things over to Jade Mears from the Don Tyson School of Innovation, and she's going to talk about how she takes these components of personalized learning in her classroom and implements them, and she'll also touch and talk about the inquiry-based model.
Hello, welcome to the second half of this presentation. I'll be your host today, Jade Mears. I am a 6th grade science teacher at Don Tyson School of Innovation, and I am so thrilled to finally be part of the Innovators Institute. I have been working at SOI for 2 years, and last year being my first year among the craziness, was so darn excited to be accepted into this institute. I just decided to throw kind of on a whim my name in the hat, going, I might only be a 2nd year teacher, but I might have something good to share, so I might as well try. and was accepted. And then, of course, we know how last year went. So when I got the email that we will be presenting this year, I was just tickled. I was so excited for this opportunity and just honored for this opportunity. A little bit about my background. I'm a third-year teacher, and what a start teaching this has been. A global pandemic. Wow, it's been awesome, though. I'm very thankful to be in my position. I started my first year in 5th grade in Fayetteville School, and then quickly knew that I wanted to move to a little less traditional style, because I love trying new things. And I had tried this in that 5th grade classroom. I had tried inquiry and some of this blended learning and this personalized learning before, and it just didn't quite fit. But I knew that I wanted to also learn some skills that it could fit anywhere. So I was super thankful. I threw my name in the hat and applied to SOI, and was so thankful that Ms. Bort shared that same vision and said, welcome aboard. So last year, 2020, was my first full year of starting inquiry. And of course, it was a little bit of a half year, as we know, but I was very thrilled at how much the kids loved it. And not only that, how much I loved getting to know them through inquiry. One of my favorite quotes is from Trevor McKenzie in his Dive Into Inquiry book, is that all students deserve a chance to explore their passions, their interests, and their curiosity. And that really sums up why I love teaching inquiry-based learning, why I love doing and teaching the way I do. Because for me in school, I came from a very traditional school system of you learn what you learn. And I thought it was wonderful and very interesting, but I never had time to explore those passions, those little quirks. Like, for example, I remember being in middle school, being absolutely obsessed with the Titanic. And if you're a middle school teacher, you know that that's some weird reason, a little bit of a commonality. Every year I've run into another kid who's obsessed with the Titanic. So I wanted to give this opportunity as a teacher to let's tie in some of these passions of these kids, because they deserve the chance to be curious and to explore. And it's not a free-for-all, because that was one thing I know I was a little nervous about when I first started. But there are different levels. And I kind of go back to that Trevor McKenzie book, The Dive Into Inquiry, because that really got my foot in the door with how I was going to structure this in my classroom. So as I have on the graphic here, there are several types of student inquiry. There's structured inquiry, which is very similar to like a whole group style method, where students are following the lead of the teacher and then they engage in inquiry together. And then there's controlled inquiry, where teachers choose the topics and identify and resources, but then students will use to answer questions that they might ask. So that's a little bit more controlled, and I love the visual of the pool. We've got like the little baby group hanging on the wall there. We've got the kickboard a little bit more on their own. We have guided, where the coach is even out of the pool, where the teacher changes the topics in the or chooses the topics in the question, and the students design a product or solution. And finally, to inquiry, or free inquiry, where students totally choose their topics without reference to have to have prescribed outcomes. And I've dabbled in all four of these. I like to stay mostly in between controlled and guided. That's just where I am in my journey. And I'm going to show you in these next couple slides of some of the things that I have done that really stays in that controlled and guided area. So in the middle school science classroom, there is a process that we follow. I teach 6th grade science. I think I mentioned that, but I just want to reiterate as we go through. So everything is going to be in the context of me teaching a science class. But we begin with exploration. So this is really my content. This is how I teach them what they need to know. So it begins with understanding of the topics. We have mini lessons that students may do whole group. They may do individual. A lot of it is different multimedia based. I like to throw in a lot of things like videos, Nearpods, Vocabulary is my jam. I love vocabulary because it just gets in their heads. But a lot of our content is through these little mini spurts. And then the next thing would be asking questions. And asking questions is such a simple idea, yet it is more complex than you think, because there's a whole lot of difference between asking a question and asking a good question. So we spend the first part of the year really diving into what does it mean to ask good questions, and especially in a science classroom. So from this understanding of our content, we have our mini lessons, and we build on to, okay, what are some specific and measurable questions we can explore deeper into the topics? The third part of this kind of building blocks is the documentation. It's everybody's favorite thing, I know. But no, documentation is a critical skill that students need to learn. And especially in these inquiry projects, they create the documents. I have structured templates for them, but towards the end of the year, I do open it up to, okay, document your research how you best like to document your research. So this could be things like keeping their information on a Google Doc or a slide. This could be creating some kind of document tracker to track their progress, as well as keep their information. And then finally, which is the most, I think, favorite of all of us, is the presentations. Kids love it. I love it. We invite as many people as we can to come see in the presentations, and we highlight the learning. And it also sparks new questions. I love seeing when we have our inquiry presentation days, and us being the unique school we are, we're a 6th through 12th school, we have a lot of high school kids that will come in and ask these new questions of our 6th graders and just spark even newer interest into the topic. They go, well, I don't know, but I want to find out. And so that is just joy to see. And a critical part of this is also self and peer evaluation. So not only will I be going through and giving them my feedback, but they give each other feedback of, hey, this was a really great question. You hit a DOK level of 3 on this one. Way to go. Or, hey, what if you extended this topic a little bit more? So seeing that peer process is also just an amazing part of the learning. And then self-evaluation really gives them that opportunity to reflect on some of those more social science. Did they work well as a team? Did they get their work done on time? Things like that. So it's a really great mix of these building blocks that is not only great for the project and the inquiry, but these are giving them even bigger life skills in the end through this inquiry process. So let's talk about kind of the types of inquiry. I show this to my students when they first start in our class. This is like week 1, week 2 things that we go over. So again, Trevor McKenzie, he's kind of the guru of inquiry. I will quote him till the cows come home. I love his stuff. And he also has so many great graphics, like his sketchnoting graphics, and everything is wonderful. But here are some of the pillars of inquiry that help students choose where they're going with their projects. So a pillar could be exploring a passion. It could be aiming for a goal. It could be delving into your curiosities or taking on a new challenge. And I try to hit these 4 different pillars of inquiry through different projects throughout the year. Sometimes students are picking their topic. Sometimes students are given a topic, but they have to come up with questions. Sometimes we're just aiming for a goal. So it just kind of depends on what style we're doing. But let's go into some of the projects that we do. I have 3 types of inquiry projects, and I have some actual student examples to show here today. So first off is Genius Hour, which is the passion project. We go back to that 4 pillars, that's that passion. Inquiry projects, which are our scientific inquiry assignments. And then finally, argument driven, that is focused on just the process of inquiring and having a good, solid argument. So first, starting with Genius Hour, which I think to this day is still my students' favorite. This is where they get the freedom to explore their passions. Back when I was talking about me in middle school, how I always wanted to be able to explore things like the Titanic. And I'm sure I had many other quite nerdy things that I was into and still am. But this is uninterrupted time during the school day where students get to choose something they're passionate about and use those skills like research, engineering, skill building, and much, much more to find the answers for themselves. So here are some examples we have. One of my favorite parts of Genius Hour is when students become passionate about a cause. And a lot of times this happens when we are going over a human impact unit. So this is a student's Genius Hour down here at the bottom, these slideshow captures. They had a solution to pollution that they came up with. So they created recycling bins for our classrooms and our zones. So over here, they start with the questions. As you can see, our driving questions. Every research project or every inquiry is a research project. So they come up with these questions, they come up with solutions, and then they actually built this project. They built the recycle bins out of recycled material and then put them up around the zones, which was so cool. So our second part is the inquiry project. This is in the actual classroom. So this is where students are exploring the content through personal connections and interests, and the projects include real-world connections. So here is an example by a student who took the idea of learning the 3 different types of thermal energy transfer and put it in a real-life scenario. So she made a comic strip as well as took some of the vocabulary words and turned them into a crossword puzzle, which was so cool. And then actually printed it out and had students fill it out and solve the crossword, which was awesome. But what's really neat about these projects is that students get to show off their passion. So we start with a topic. Let's say we're in the weather unit of 6th grade science. We're learning all about weather. So students have the mini lessons and all the content that they go through daily assignments. But in the big retrospect of the project, students get to choose what about weather they're interested in. They get to choose any real world scenarios to look up, like tornadoes or hurricanes, and then they create an entire project where they can choose their medium of product of what they want to make. So it could be an art-based thing, it could be a simulation, it could be a video. We've had some very fun mockumentaries in the past. But they choose their topic within the content to really highlight their project. And this just does wonders for engagement. I still can't believe some of these projects that students come up with because they're so passionate about it. They get to choose what they want to know and research the things that they want to know about. And so they put all hands in, all dive into the project. So as far as engagement, it's one of the coolest things I've ever seen as a teacher, to see just students love and find their passion even within topics. And then finally, some argument-driven inquiry. So students experiment, create arguments, make claims, present evidence, ask questions, and hold academic conversations. So this is more of a lab-based scenario, and I have an example here of a student who created an at-home lab all about the 3 different ways to make peanut butter cookies using thermal energy. And so he grilled them and explained the science behind that. He made them in the oven and explained the science of thermal energy transfer through that, and was documenting this the whole entire time. So this is more into the conversational piece. So the student came up with this entire project by themselves. This was their inquiry project because they chose that they wanted to make cookies and they wanted to do this. But the argument piece comes in the classroom conversations. And ADI is actually a whole separate kind of entity and training. And so I've been thankful enough to be part of a couple of those. And so I do implement a little of that training within some of our inquiry, especially when we present our evidence. So when we present the evidence, we have students ask each other questions and then have their evidence presented in some sort of like whiteboarding, or in this case, it was through a slideshow, and that holds academic conversations that they have with their peers, as well as some self-reflection. So that's another third example of how that works. But thank you so much. I hope that's a fun little dive in and maybe spark some ideas of what you could do in your classroom. I highly recommend starting with Genius Hour. That is the easiest and most fun, but it's also one of the things that you have to lose a little bit of control. And that's, as a teacher, I know can be very difficult, but you'll just see the engagement, the conversations. It's incredible once you kind of give up that little bit of wiggle room and let students own what they are learning. It's an incredible game changer. But I really hope that you've learned a little bit of something, and thank you so much for being a part of the Innovators Institute, for listening to this presentation, and for all you have done this year. I am 100% with you of how crazy of a couple years that this has been, and I could not have done it without the support of our amazing just teaching staff, all of every support system we have in the building. So any teachers out there, thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you for joining this session. To request a certificate of attendance, you can access the link at the bottom of the session description, scan the QR code here, or go to bit.ly/I2 certificate. Bit.ly shorteners are case sensitive, so please be sure to use all uppercase letters. Hear what insight other I2 attendees and presenters might have on this session and other breakout sessions by connecting with the Innovation Institute community on Facebook or Twitter at I2 Esdale or in Attendify's interactive features. And don't forget to mark your calendar for June 8th and 9th to join us for I2 2022. Thank you.